A comic says funny things. A comedian says things funny.
Bob Newhart was never supposed to be famous. He wasn't a born performer. He was an accountant, shy, awkward, terrified of crowds. Yet his very first comedy album outsold everyone, even the Beatles, and won him Grammys he didn't even think he deserved. Hollywood doubted him, but he rewrote sitcoms, stayed scandal-free, and built a 60-year marriage that defined his life. And now, with his passing, the hidden struggles, shocking victories, and untold truths behind Bob Newhart's quiet genius are finally coming to light. Bob Newhart's story doesn't begin with red carpets or roaring crowds. It begins with quiet, ordinary days in Oak Park, Illinois. Born in 1929 to a middle-class Catholic family, Bob grew up in a strict but loving household that valued discipline over showmanship. He attended Catholic schools, went to Loyola University Chicago, and studied business administration, hardly the background of someone destined for comedy greatness. He was reserved, light, and soft-spoken, never the class clown. If anything, he was the opposite. After graduation, Bob served briefly in the U.S. Army during the Korean War, though he was discharged before seeing combat. Even then, his shyness was obvious. Fellow soldiers remembered him as witty in conversation, but never the type to seek the spotlight. When he returned home, he settled into a quiet career as an accountant. Day after day, he sat behind a desk crunching numbers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe. And, for Bob, that seemed just fine. But here's the twist. He wasn't particularly good at it. He later admitted to padding his hours because he was so slow with calculations. "It just wasn't my gift," he said. That hidden frustration, his feeling of being misplaced in the world of balance sheets, planted the seeds for what came next. The turning point came almost accidentally. Bob and a co-worker, bored out of their minds at a corporate job, began recording silly, one-sided phone conversations to amuse themselves. They weren't rehearsed or polished, just long, rambling bits where Bob pretended to be everything from a security guard to Abraham Lincoln, trapped in everyday bureaucratic nonsense. The humor was dry, subtle, and full of awkward pauses that no one else would dare leave in. Somehow, those tapes ended up at Warner Brothers Records. The label executives couldn't believe what they heard. Here was a man with no stage background, no nightclub routine, no professional polish. Yet his deadpan delivery was unlike anything in comedy at the time. In 1960, they signed him to record his debut album, The Button-Down Mind of Bob Newhart. What happened next was beyond imagination. That album didn't just sell, it blew up. It rocketed to #1 on the Billboard charts, becoming the first comedy album in history to do so. America was suddenly obsessed with a shy, stammering accountant who looked and sounded like their next-door neighbor. In one stroke, Bob Newhart went from filing tax returns to outselling the biggest stars in music. But there was a catch. While the country crowned him their new comedy king, Bob himself was terrified. He had never truly performed live. Could a shy accountant really survive the crushing pressure of sudden stardom? That question would haunt him as the spotlight only grew brighter. The year was 1961, and Bob Newhart's life was about to flip upside down. Just 1 year earlier, he had been an unknown accountant who stumbled into a record deal. Now, he was walking into the Grammy Awards as a nominee, an event so surreal, he later admitted he felt like an imposter. After all, he wasn't a musician. He wasn't even a seasoned stage comedian. He was just Bob, the guy with the hesitant voice and nervous pauses. And yet, he was about to make history. His debut album, The Button-Down Mind of Bob Newhart, had already shocked the entertainment world by topping the Billboard charts. At a time when Elvis Presley, Frank Sinatra, and even the Beatles were dominating record sales, nobody believed a spoken-word comedy record could compete. But Bob's routines were everywhere. Radio DJs across the country spun tracks from the album daily, from his legendary Abe Lincoln vs. Madison Avenue sketch to his absurd one-sided phone calls. Families gathered around record players not to hear music, but to laugh at Bob Newhart's voice. When the Grammys came, the industry couldn't ignore it. Bob's album won Album of the Year, beating out heavyweights from the world of music. That alone was unheard of. But the shock didn't stop there. He also won Best New Artist, making him the only comedian in history to ever receive the award. To this day, he holds that record. On top of that, he took home Best Comedy Performance, sweeping the night with 3 wins. Think about how insane that was. Here was a man who had performed on stage only a handful of times, suddenly outshining musicians who had toured for years. And unlike many performers, he didn't even have a stage persona or a clever name. He wasn't hiding behind Johnny Punchline or the Great Bobini. He was just Bob Newhart. His real name, his real awkwardness, his real stammer, that honesty became his brand. But behind the glitz of the Grammys, Bob was crumbling. He felt unworthy, terrified that he had peaked too early. He wasn't sure he could replicate the magic in front of live audiences. In fact, the very idea of standing on a stage filled him with dread. Critics were calling him comedy's future. But Bob wasn't sure he had one. Because the next test wasn't about records or awards. It was about whether Bob Newhart could survive as a live performer. And what the world didn't know was that stage fright threatened to undo everything he had built. Bob Newhart had the Grammys, the best-selling comedy album in the world, and the praise of critics. But there was a truth that only he knew. He was terrified of live performance. In fact, the very thing that most comedians craved, the stage, was his greatest fear. Unlike other comics who honed their craft in smoky clubs, Bob had skipped that entire grind. His debut album had been recorded in a studio, not in front of a crowd. So when promoters started booking him into theaters across the country, he was in uncharted waters. The lights, the rows of expectant faces, the silence before his first words, every detail felt suffocating. He would later admit that he sometimes felt physically ill before stepping on stage. To cope, Bob leaned on nervous habits. Early on, he'd light cigarettes during performances, using the smoke breaks as cover for his shaky pauses. What he thought was a weakness became his strength. Those long silences, the stammer, the hesitant delivery, they weren't mistakes. They were comedy timing disguised as nerves. Audiences didn't see fear, they saw a character. They laughed because they recognized themselves in his discomfort. Still, the industry wasn't convinced. Executives whispered that Bob wasn't built for longevity. His style was too quiet, too odd, too subtle. How could a man who barely raised his voice compete with the booming comics of the era? He was going up against legends like Lenny Bruce, Jonathan Winters, and later Richard Pryor, all performers who filled the room with energy. Compared to them, Bob looked like he was shrinking into the background. But audiences didn't care. They were drawn to him because he didn't pretend to be larger than life. He was awkward, average, and human, yet somehow magnetic. In one famous appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, he leaned so heavily into his stammering, slow-burn delivery that even Sullivan couldn't stop laughing. That's when people realized the nervousness was the act, and the act was brilliant. But Bob himself wasn't convinced. He lived with a constant fear that one bad night could expose him as a fraud. He worried that he wasn't really funny enough, that his success was a fluke. And those doubts grew louder as Hollywood came calling. The next step wasn't the stage, it was television. And TV executives had no idea what to make of a man who could get laughs without a single punchline. By the early 1970s, Bob Newhart had survived the gauntlet of live performance and proven his comedy wasn't a fluke. But the next frontier, television, was trickier. Network executives liked him, but they didn't understand him. How do you build a sitcom around a man whose biggest laughs came from silences? In 1972, CBS decided to take the gamble anyway. The result was The Bob Newhart Show, a series that would quietly rewrite the rules of TV comedy. Bob played Dr. Robert Hartley, a psychologist living in Chicago. Unlike the zany, slapstick-heavy shows of the era, this sitcom didn't rely on wild antics or canned punchlines. The humor was in dialogue, low-key, conversational, even painfully awkward at times. Bob's character wasn't a wisecracking lead. He was the calm center of chaos, reacting to patients, colleagues, and friends with his trademark stammer and deadpan disbelief. In other words, the laughs didn't come from jokes. They came from human behavior. Behind the scenes, The writers struggled at first. They weren't used to scripting around silence. Bob's comedy required breathing room, long pauses that traditional sitcom pacing didn't allow. But once they leaned into it, the show clicked. His chemistry with Suzanne Pleshette, who played his wife Emily, gave the series a grounded warmth that kept audiences hooked. Their marriage felt real, full of gentle bickering and quiet affection, not the over-the-top hijinks TV couples usually endured. Viewers saw themselves in Bob and Emily Hartley, and that was the magic. Executives had worried that audiences wouldn't get it. After all, other hit sitcoms of the time leaned heavily on laugh tracks and outrageous scenarios. But audiences connected instantly with Bob's understated style. They laughed because they recognized the awkwardness of office politics, the absurdity of therapy sessions, and the quiet frustrations of married life. The show proved that comedy didn't have to be loud or exaggerated to dominate prime time. By its second season, The Bob Newhart Show was a smash success, running for 6 years and becoming a staple of Saturday night television. Bob had not only transitioned from accountant to comedy star, he was now redefining what American sitcoms could look like. But just as the industry thought they had Bob figured out, he returned in the 1980s with another sitcom. And this time, he didn't just deliver laughs, he pulled off one of the most shocking finales in television history. By 1982, Bob Newhart was already a legend. He had a Grammy-sweeping comedy album, a classic sitcom, and a reputation as one of America's most unique comedic voices. But many assumed his moment had passed. The entertainment world was shifting toward louder, edgier comedians, and executives doubted that Bob's quiet, deadpan style could anchor another hit. Then came Newhart. The premise was deceptively simple. Bob played Dick Loudon, a mild-mannered author who, with his wife, decides to run a small inn in rural Vermont. It didn't sound like the recipe for must-see TV. No flashy hook, no wild concept, just a straight man surrounded by oddballs. But that was the brilliance. Bob didn't need to be outrageous. He thrived as the calm eye in a hurricane of eccentric characters. From the handyman George to the unforgettable trio Larry, Daryl, and Daryl, the cast became a showcase for Bob's perfect slow-burn reactions. The show wasn't just successful, it ran for 8 seasons, quietly dominating the 1980s sitcom landscape. But its crowning achievement came in 1990, during the series finale. After 8 years of storytelling, the writers and Bob decided to attempt something radical, something that had never been done before. In the final moments, Dick Loudon is struck in the head by a golf ball and loses consciousness. The screen fades to black. Then suddenly, the camera opens not on the Vermont inn, but on a familiar Chicago bedroom. Bob Newhart sits up in bed, except this time, he's not Dick Loudon. He's Dr. Robert Hartley, his character from The Bob Newhart Show. Next to him lies Suzanne Pleshette, his former sitcom wife. The entire 8-year run of Newhart was revealed to have been nothing more than a dream inside his first character's head. The live audience gasped, then roared with laughter. It was one of the boldest, most creative finales in TV history, instantly cementing itself as legendary. To this day, critics rank it among the greatest sitcom endings ever, right alongside MASH and The Sopranos. Even Jerry Seinfeld later admitted it influenced how he thought about the ending of his own show. What made it brilliant was its simplicity. Bob's career had started with awkward pauses, quiet subversions, and the art of not giving audiences what they expected. The Newhart finale was the ultimate payoff to that philosophy. It was understated, clever, and completely unexpected. With that single twist, Bob Newhart reminded the world that he wasn't just a comedian, he was a master craftsman of timing and surprise. But while his professional life reached dizzying heights, his personal life told an even rarer story. A Hollywood marriage that lasted more than 60 years, untouched by scandal, and powered by something far deeper than fame. In Hollywood, where marriages often burn out faster than sitcom pilots, Bob Newhart lived a life that seemed almost impossible, steady, private, and completely free of scandal. While countless stars of his generation became tabloid fixtures, Bob quietly built a family life that became the true backbone of his career. In 1963, Bob married Virginia "Ginny" Quinn, the daughter of actor Bill Quinn. From the very beginning, their marriage stood apart. Hollywood was filled with affairs, divorces, and public blow-ups. But Bob and Ginny were different. They built their world around family, raising 4 children and insulating themselves from the chaos of the industry. While Bob was filming shows or touring, Ginny became his anchor, making sure that home was always a place of balance and normalcy. The secret, Bob often said, was laughter, but not the kind he delivered on stage. It was the small, quiet humor between 2 people who trusted each other completely. When arguments started to rise, he'd crack a dry joke, and suddenly, the tension was gone. He credited Ginny with keeping his feet firmly planted on the ground, reminding him that fame was fleeting, but family was forever. "I won the lottery," he once said about his marriage. Bob also built friendships that reflected his loyalty and humility. His most famous friendship was with comedian Don Rickles, one of the sharpest, most cutting comics of all time. Rickles insulted everyone, but Bob was his opposite, calm, patient, almost shy. Somehow, the two became inseparable. Their wives even grew close, often vacationing together. The contrast between Don's loud, abrasive humor and Bob's quiet, understated wit made their bond legendary. It was proof that Bob didn't need the spotlight. He valued connection above all else. Faith also shaped his life. A lifelong Catholic, Bob often said his beliefs guided him in both career and family. He wasn't preachy about it, but he lived by it, turning down projects that didn't align with his principles. Unlike many comedians who thrived on pushing boundaries into darker territory, Bob built an entire legacy without resorting to shock or scandal. And perhaps that's why his 60-year marriage endured when so many others didn't. When Ginny passed away in 2021, Bob was devastated. Friends said it was like losing half of himself. But even in grief, he remained a symbol of loyalty, proof that a life in entertainment didn't have to be consumed by it. Still, Bob's story wasn't finished. Even after decades of success, his influence was far from fading. Because in his later years, he would be celebrated not just as a pioneer of comedy, but as a legend whose quiet genius continued to shape the art form for generations to come. When Bob Newhart passed away in 2024 at the age of 94, the entertainment world didn't just lose a comedian, it lost one of the most important architects of modern comedy. His death marked the end of an era, but his influence was everywhere, woven into the DNA of stand-up and sitcoms that came after him. What set Bob apart was that he never relied on shock, vulgarity, or theatrics to get laughs. He relied on timing, silence, and authenticity. His nervous stammer, the hesitant pauses, the way he let the audience fill in the gaps, those tools became his signature. What others might have seen as weakness, he turned into brilliance. And comedians who came after him noticed. Jerry Seinfeld once admitted that Newhart's low-key style shaped the way he approached observational comedy. Jim Gaffigan called him the godfather of quiet comedy, while Conan O'Brien said that Bob taught him the power of letting awkwardness breathe. Even today, when comedians like Nate Bargatze or Dimitri Martin perform with understated, deadpan styles, the shadow of Bob Newhart is there. His fingerprints are everywhere. And it wasn't just comedy. In 2013, when Bob guest starred on The Big Bang Theory, audiences erupted in joy. At 83 years old, he played Professor Proton, a character both hilarious and heartfelt. That performance earned him his very first Emmy Award, decades after he had already changed comedy forever. It was as if the industry was finally catching up to what audiences had always known. Bob Newhart wasn't just funny, he was timeless. But beyond the awards, the shows, and the legacy, what people remember most is his humanity. He was the rare Hollywood figure who managed to stay grounded, to remain kind, and to put family before fame. He didn't chase controversy. He didn't burn out. He endured. And when he finally took his last bow, he left behind not just laughter, but a roadmap for how to live a life of integrity in a world that often rewards the opposite. Today, Bob Newhart is remembered not just as a comedian, but as a quiet revolutionary. He proved that subtlety could be just as powerful as noise, that humility could outshine arrogance, and that sometimes the shyest voice in the room leaves the deepest echo. And perhaps that's the true legacy of Bob Newhart. Not the Grammys, not the Emmys, not even the iconic sitcoms, but the simple fact that he made people laugh without ever betraying who he was. A stammering, soft-spoken accountant who changed comedy forever. And even now, long after he's gone, the world is still laughing with him.